January 10th, 1954. A passenger jet climbs to cruising altitude over the Mediterranean. 35 people on board. Nothing unusual reported by the crew. It had taken off from Rome that morning, continuing a long route that had already stopped in Singapore, Bangkok, and Cairo without a single problem. Then, without warning, radio contact simply stops. No distress call, no mayday, just silence. Wreckage is later found scattered across the seafloor near the island of Elba. Investigators spend months piecing together fragments of metal, trying to understand how a fully functioning aircraft, cruising normally, could simply come apart in midair. 3 months later, it happens again to a nearly identical aircraft. 21 more people gone. The answer, when investigators finally found it, came down to a shape. A small, seemingly harmless design choice sitting on every window of that aircraft, repeated dozens of times around the fuselage, that turned out to be quietly tearing the plane apart from the inside with every single flight. Think about this. You've flown on dozens of flights. Small regional jets, massive long-haul aircraft, budget airlines, luxury carriers, different manufacturers, different decades, different corners of the world. But every single airplane window you've ever pressed your forehead against while looking down at the clouds has the exact same basic shape, rounded, oval, with no sharp corners anywhere in sight. Why does every commercial airplane on Earth use this one specific window shape, without exception, across every airline and every manufacturer for the past 70 years? Not a stylistic trend that came and went, a shape so universal that a square or rectangular airplane window would look immediately, instinctively wrong to you, even if you've never once consciously thought about why. You're probably thinking, easy. Rounded shapes just look nicer, more aerodynamic, more modern. That's the obvious answer, and it sounds reasonable on the surface. Except it completely falls apart the moment you look at the very first commercial jet airliner ever built, which didn't have rounded windows at all. It had large, elegant, nearly square windows, deliberately designed that way to give passengers a more spectacular view of the world below. And that decision, more than any other single design choice in aviation history, ended up killing dozens of people before anyone understood why. To understand what actually happened, we have to go back to the early 1950s, to a groundbreaking aircraft called the Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jet airliner, which entered service in the spring of 1952 to genuine worldwide astonishment. Before the Comet, commercial flight meant loud, vibrating propeller planes flying relatively low and slow. The Comet changed everything overnight. It flew roughly twice as fast and twice as high as anything passengers had experienced before, in a smooth, whisper-quiet cabin that felt like something from the future. Britain had, for one brief shining moment, leapfrogged the rest of the world into the jet age. The engineers who designed the Comet weren't careless. They tested the aircraft extensively, calculating exactly how much pressure the fuselage needed to withstand during repeated flights, then building in a safety margin far beyond what regulations actually required. Aviation rules of the era demanded the cabin structure survive 1.3 times the expected pressure during flight. De Havilland's engineers designed the Comet to withstand roughly 2.5 times that expected pressure, nearly double the required safety margin. By every standard anyone knew to test against at the time, the aircraft was safe. What nobody fully understood yet, because nobody had ever needed to understand it before, was a phenomenon called metal fatigue. Every time the Comet climbed to cruising altitude, its cabin had to be pressurized to keep passengers comfortable and breathing normally in the thin, high-altitude air. Every time it descended back toward the ground, that pressure released again. This cycle, pressurizing and depressurizing, happened on every single flight, thousands of times across an aircraft's operational life. And each cycle put a small amount of stress on the metal skin of the fuselage, particularly concentrated at any point where the smooth curve of the metal was interrupted by a cutout, like a window or a door. Here's where the window shape becomes the entire story. A rounded opening spreads mechanical stress evenly across its entire edge, the same way pulling on a stretched piece of fabric around a circular hole distributes force smoothly all the way around. But a nearly square opening, even one with gently rounded corners, concentrates that same stress dramatically at each corner point, instead of spreading it out. Engineers now describe this using the concept of a stress concentration factor, a way of measuring exactly how much more force builds up at a sharp corner, compared to a smooth curve carrying the same overall load. At the corners of the comet's window cutouts, that concentrated stress was significantly higher than de Havilland's original calculations had predicted, high enough that microscopic cracks began quietly forming with every single pressurization cycle, invisible from the outside, growing a tiny fraction larger each time the aircraft climbed and descended. After the second comet came apart in April of 1954, investigators recovered enough wreckage to test the theory directly. They submerged an actual comet fuselage in a massive water tank built specifically for the investigation, repeatedly pressurizing and depressurizing it to simulate thousands of flights compressed into a much shorter time frame, cycle after cycle, day after day, watching for any sign of weakness. The fuselage failed exactly where investigators suspected it would, at the corner of a window cutout, cracking outward from that single concentrated stress point until the entire structure gave way. The mystery had its answer. It wasn't a bomb, sabotage, or pilot error. It was geometry, quietly working against the aircraft on every single flight since the day it entered service. The fix, once investigators understood the actual mechanism, turned out to be remarkably simple to describe, even though it reshaped the entire aviation industry. Round the corners completely. Eliminate every flat edge and sharp angle from any opening cut into a pressurized fuselage, spreading stress evenly around a smooth curve instead of concentrating it anywhere at all. Every commercial jet built since has followed that exact principle, not as a stylistic preference, but as a hard structural requirement baked into aviation regulations worldwide. That small oval shape you glance past without a second thought on every flight is a direct, permanent engineering response to a disaster that killed 56 people across 2 flights in 1954. The consequences reached far beyond window shape alone. The Comet investigation effectively created the entire modern discipline of metal fatigue testing in aviation. Before these crashes, fatigue was poorly understood and rarely tested with any rigor. After them, every aircraft manufacturer on Earth became required to demonstrate, through extensive physical testing, exactly how many pressurization cycles an airframe could survive before fatigue became a genuine risk, with substantial safety margins built in beyond that number. No commercial airliner since has ever suffered a pressurization fatigue failure of the specific kind that destroyed those 2 comets. The lesson, once learned at enormous cost, has never needed to be relearned. There's a sobering business consequence sitting alongside the human one. The Comet disasters didn't just ground one aircraft model, they erased Britain's early lead in commercial jet aviation almost overnight, giving American manufacturers like Boeing and Douglas the time they needed to develop their own jet airliners, with the lessons of the Comet's failure already fully absorbed into their designs. An entire nation's aerospace advantage, built over years of genuine innovation, evaporated because of stress, concentrated at the corner of a window most passengers never thought twice about. So, what if de Havilland's engineers had chosen rounded windows from the very beginning, purely for aesthetic reasons, without ever understanding the structural reason it actually mattered? The Comet might have flown on successfully for years without incident, and the entire discipline of metal fatigue testing might have developed decades later, discovered only after some other aircraft, from some other manufacturer, eventually failed for the exact same underlying reason. The specific tragedy of the Comet might have simply been delayed and handed to someone else entirely, the lesson learned at a different cost, on a different aircraft, at a different point in aviation history. Remember the last time you glanced out an airplane window without a single thought about its shape? It was never a design choice made for comfort or style. It's a permanent, physical memorial to 56 people who boarded an aircraft everyone believed was safe, built by engineers who had genuinely done everything the science of their era told them to do, and still weren't enough. So next time you're 35,000 feet in the air, resting your head against that smooth, curved window, remember what's actually surrounding you. You're not just looking through a pane of aircraft glass. You're looking through 70 years of hard-earned aviation safety, shaped directly by a disaster nobody saw coming until it was far too late to stop. You've flown past that window 100 times without a second thought. Now you know why.